Etymology and historical origin of the baby name George. The etymological origin of the name George comes from the Greek geōrgos, which means farmer. The elements are derived from the Greek ga, earth, and ergen, to work. The name George was most notably borne by an early 4th century saint who would eventually become the patron saint of England about 1,000 years later in the 14th century. Prior, this St. George figure was quite a bit more popular in the Greek Orthodox religion during medieval period rather than in the Western Roman Catholic faith. St. George was a prominent military soldier in the Roman army under the pagan emperor Diocletian. He refused to denounce his Christian faith and was thus beheaded. He is usually depicted killing a dragon, the devil, to rescue a beautiful lady, Christianity. St. George's legend was resuscitated during the Crusades and would shortly thereafter become the patron saint of England and protector of the royal family. The name really didn't take off in popularity until the 1500s. Adding extra currency to the name was King George I of England, who came to the throne in 1714. George I actually came from Germany, then Hanover, to succeed Queen and as her closest non-Catholic blood relative, Protestantism being a necessary prerequisite of an English monarch. Ironically, this George couldn't even speak English and wasn't exactly enamored with Great Britain, so he was usually fending off uprisings. The name George was shared by 6 different kings of the United Kingdom. For more information on all the Georges, see historical references below. The name is still extremely popular in England, ranked number 11 in 2009, and also on the top 100 list of most commonly used boys' names in Scotland and Australia. Personality of the boy named George. The 3 energy is powerful and enthusiastic. These personalities are cheerful, full of self-expression, and often quite emotional. They have an artistic flair and gift of gab that makes them natural entertainers. Their joyfulness bubbles over, and their infectious exuberance draws a crowd. The 3 personality is like a child, forever young and full of delight. They are charming, witty, and generally happy people. The 3 personality lives in the now and has a spontaneous nature. 3 seem to live with a bright and seemingly unbreakable aura that attracts others to them. In turn, they are deeply loyal and loving to their friends and family. Luck also has a tendency to favor number 3s. Popularity of the boy named George. The name George was a top 5 pick in America back when the U.S. government began tracking naming trends in 1880. It sustained a position on the top 10 up until 1940. From that point on, the name George slowly declined in usage on the charts, but only about 10 places per decade. Even as recently as the 1970s, George was squarely in the top 50. For the first time in the history of American boy names, George fell off the top 100 list in 1993. The name continues to diminish in prominence on the charts and may be headed to fall outside of the top 200 list in the next decade. Nevertheless, George is timeless and enduring, if even a bit too old-fashioned for today's naming styles. Not surprisingly, the name still barely hangs onto a top 100 position in the states of Maine and Massachusetts, a couple of our New England states. George is a classic pick for parents who prefer to follow their own preferences without being influenced by fleeting naming trends. Once a common boy's name, George is now reserved for only the few brave and mighty little soldiers out there. Further, given the name's etymology, George is a great choice if you intend to raise a little farm boy. Quick facts on George. Gender, boy. Origin, English. Number of syllables, 1. Ranking popularity, 157. Pronunciation, George. Simple meaning, farmer, earthworker. Characteristics of George. Social, dramatic, popular, happy, communicative, optimistic, creative. Cultural references to the baby name, George. Literary characters of the baby name George. George is a wealthy young African-American man who is courting beneath a younger in Lorraine Hansberry's groundbreaking play, A Raisin in the Sun, which debuted on Broadway in 1959. It was also made into a film, a musical, and a television production. George represents those in African American society who are willing to neutralize their heritage in order to assimilate into the larger white society. In so doing, he jeopardizes his chances with Beneatha, who is ever growing, learning, evolving, and embracing her culture wholeheartedly. George Knightley is the protagonist of Jane Austen's novel, Emma, written in 1816. He is a wealthy, kind, well-mannered man of high moral character, every mother's dream of a son-in-law, who stands in contrast to the initially self-centered nature of the young Emma. He is, after all, 17 years her senior, and wastes no time in pointing out her faults to her, all the while being very much in love with her himself. After a lot of meddlesome matchmaking on Emma's part, mistakenly placed suspicions, petty jealousies, and the like, the two get together when Emma finally comes to her senses. And how's this for a good son-in-law? He moves in with Emma and her father at their estate so that the old man will not need to miss his daughter. They don't make Em like that anymore. George is one of the main characters in Thornton Wilder's iconic Pulitzer Prize-winning play, Our Town, first performed in 1938, and a staple of high school theatrical productions ever since. George is the all-American boy in the early 20th century, in spades. He is a star baseball player and the president of the senior class. He's a typical boy, sometimes neglecting his chores and his homework, but ultimately a well-meaning, good-natured boy, with expectations of being a farmer in his little town. He marries his childhood sweetheart, Emily, to whom he proposes over an ice cream soda. When tragedy strikes, and Emily dies in childbirth, George takes on the symbolic grief of the world, and represents for us the playwright's message, that life is precious and short, and is to be lived as fully as possible every single moment. George Osborne is the dashing and utterly self-absorbed young man in William Makepeace Thackeray's 1847 satirical novel, Vanity Fair, one of the many who fall victim to the charms of Miss Becky Sharp. He is an unfortunately profligate character who marries against his father's wishes, flirts with other women, spends all his money, is disinherited, and dies in battle, leaving a wife and son without any means of support. Seemingly irredeemable, he does have one trait that endears him to us: he is extraordinarily good-looking. Well, sometimes that counts. George Emerson is the handsome protagonist in E. M. Forster's 1908 novel, A Room with a View. Along with his father, the elder Emerson, George is a free thinker in a shackled time, a man who appreciates women for their intelligence as well as for their beauty. Although of a lower social order than the object of his love, Lucy Honeychurch, he nonetheless wins her through his passion and charm, and persuades her to elope with him, in full defiance of a social agenda that is clearly running out of steam. George Dorset is a character in Edith Wharton's 1905 novel of Manners, The House of Mirth. Like its heroine, Lily Bart, George is a victim of a society whose mores and values keep them in strict alignment with the unwritten code, and whose punishment for stepping outside that code is severe indeed. George is the epitome of the good husband of the times. He is quiet, wealthy, he indulges his wife's every whim, and he seems to overlook her infidelities. Even when one affair is made blatantly clear to him, he is convinced by her to stay in the marriage, loveless and mirthless though it may be. All to keep the machinery of society running smoothly. George Wilson is a minor but pivotal character in F. Scott Fitzgerald's 1925 classic, The Great Gatsby. Poor George is a poster boy for the axiom, bad things happen to good people. He is a hard-working man who is faithful to his wife. In fact, he adores her, and what happens to him? He finds out his wife is having an affair, he confronts her, and she dashes into the street and is killed by the fateful oncoming hit-and-run automobile. Mistakenly thinking it is Jay Gatsby who was the driver, George kills Gatsby and then turns the gun on himself. What a bum rap! George Milton is a main character in John Steinbeck's 1937 novella, Of Mice and Men. He is a migrant worker during the Great Depression who befriends and cares for the mentally disabled Lenny Small, with tragic results. He is an intelligent, thinking man, whose dream is to own a ranch, a dream that Lenny shares. George is basically a loner, but he is able to connect to humanity through his friendship with Lenny, and George's kindness toward the big, hapless man is an indication of the basic goodness in his heart. In the end, the reward for his labors is the loss of Lenny, the loss of his dreams of a ranch, and the ultimate loss of a piece of his own soul. George is a slave of a cruel master in Harriet Beecher Stowe's 1852 anti-slavery novel, which was outsold only by the Bible in the 19th century. He has an impenetrable dignity that cannot be destroyed by his brutal treatment at the hands of the white slave owner. Handsome and well-spoken, George endures many humiliations in silence, but when his wife and child are sold, he escapes to Canada with them. After attaining an education, he and his family move to France and eventually to the nation of Liberia in Africa, and he turns his back on the nation that would whip him into submission. For today's reading audience, he offers a telling counterpoint to the very Christian, long-suffering Uncle Tom, who stays with his folks and forgives all his tormentors. George Harris not only eschews white society, he also dares to challenge a God who would allow such evils to exist in the first place. We think he's right. George is the title character in Sinclair Lewis' 1922 satire of American culture, Babbitt, about a conforming, conservative, materialistic social climber in a Midwestern city who has a successful real estate business, a nice house, a wife and 2.5 children. It's not enough. Perhaps due to a midlife crisis, he is 46 years old. George begins to explore the possibilities of an alternate lifestyle. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? He switches to a liberal political view, hangs with the local bohemian crowd, has an affair, and in general, tries to find an answer to the emptiness and meaninglessness of his life. Naturally, this behavior shocks all his former friends and associates. Who knows where this kind of thing might lead? And he is shunned, barred from his clubs, and his business suffers. Well, that's not much fun either. It takes the sudden, serious illness of his wife, Myra, to bring him back to his senses. Lickety-split, he dashes home and devotes himself to her care. All is forgiven and he is welcomed back into the fold. The lingering hopes for a richer life are put on the back burner, and he dons again the cloak of respectability. The only shred of hope left to him is that his teen-aged son has dropped out of college and eloped with his girlfriend, and Babbitt somehow finds this act of rebellion a beacon of light for the boy's future and a safeguard against the dreaded life of conformity. We guess. Popular songs on George. George's Helper, The George and the Dragon, Here Comes Dumb George, King George Street, a song by Bob Dylan, a song by Lou Reed, a song by Van Morrison, Shorty George, a song by Count Basie, by George, a song by Weird Al Yankovic, a song by Foo Fighters, Boogie for George, George's Bar, a song by Squeeze, a song by UFO, The Earnest of Being George, a song by Herman's Hermits, instrumental by Skyclad, Dance With Me George, Dum Dum George, Madam George, George of the Jungle, a song by Jude, a song by Tori Amos, Goodbye George, George Jackson, Oh, George, a song by Ambrosia, a reggae song by Steel Pulse, George, a song by the Bee Gees, My Friend George, Yo George, St. George and the Dragon, a song by Pete Murray, Uncle George, Hold On George, a song by Pat Green, a song by Toto. Famous people named George. George Michael, musician, George Frederick Handel, composer, George Kell, baseball player, George McNamara, hockey player, George Foster, baseball player, George Stephanopoulos, political advisor/journalist, George Blanda, football player, George Mekon, basketball player, George Thorogood, musician, George Takei, actor, George Connor, football player, George Dudley, hockey player, George McAfee, football player, George W. Bush, U.S. President, George Hayes, hockey player, George Halas, football, George Herbert Walker Bush, U.S. President, George Davis, baseball player, George Musso, football player, George Richardson, hockey player, George Siegel, actor, George Clinton, musician, George Carlin, comedian, George Gershwin, musician, George Orwell, author, George Brett, baseball player, George Hay, hockey player, George Kelly, baseball player, George Jones, musician, George Gervin, basketball player, George Hainsworth, hockey player, George Foreman, boxing legend, George Allen, football coach, George Clooney, actor. George Steinbrenner, baseball owner, George Lucas, director/screenwriter, George Allen O'Dowd, aka Boy George/musician, George Leader, hockey player, George Burns, comic/actor/entertainer, George Lopez, actor/comedian, George Washington, first U.S. President, George Hamilton, actor, George Brown, hockey player. Historic figures with the name George. Lord Byron was a leading English poet and a leader of the Romantic movement, some of whose most famous narrative works were A Child Harold, A Pilgrimage, and A Eden 1. He was also a social activist, calling upon Parliament to honor the claims of the Luddites, the revolutionary group who opposed the mechanization of labor. Almost as well known for his personal life as for his poetry, Byron was the subject of much gossip and rumor, from the scandal that he had an affair and fathered a daughter with his half-sister, to the numerous other illicit romantic liaisons he instigated in his short life, both with men and women, to his personal excesses and debts. Club-footed from birth, Byron was exceedingly self-conscious of his defect, while being very vain about his good looks and his height, 5 euro 11 euro. It is said that he wore curlers in his hair at night, that he was a strict vegetarian who occasionally ate red meat and then purged. He was aware of his notoriety and seemed to revel in being the living epitome of the Eberonic hero. His wife coined the term Eberomania, referring to all the public attention that he got as the precursor of Tudai's super celebrities. Lord Byron fathered at least 2 daughters, one by his short-lived marriage to Annabella Milbanke Byron, another as the result of an affair, and possibly a third, the daughter his half-sister gave birth to. When his marriage ended, Byron spent the last 8 years of his life abroad, where a somewhat more forgiving societal rule prevailed. In 1824, while preparing to join the Greek uprising against Ottoman rule, he contracted a fever, was subjected to bloodletting, and finally died in Greece, where he is revered as a national hero. It took somewhat longer for such status to attach to him in his homeland, but in 1969, a mere 145 years after his death, a memorial to George Gordon, Lord Byron, was finally placed in Westminster Abbey. Oh, those impulsive Brits!